Good afternoon. This is a Romeo and Juliet lesson, and the focus of this lesson is to have your general knowledge of the text as a whole um, developed, and to explore the portrayal of Romeo as a protagonist. Protagonist is a word used for a central character. So, we're going to focus on Romeo in this lesson, and there will be a task at the end. So I'm going to just run through Romeo's portrayal throughout the play, so you've got that overview of how his character changes and develops. So it might be a good idea to make some notes, and you can see that there are some keywords in bold, and there are some quotations as well that you might want to jot down so that you can build up a character study of Romeo. So Romeo matures from adolescence to adulthood as a result of his love for Juliet and his unfortunate involvement in the feud. He develops from an initial comic character to a tragic figure. So at the start, he's a little bit of a comic character because he's presented as a Petrarchan lover. Now, this is a little bit of context. So context is where you understand the background of the play, the historical and social and cultural aspects of the play. So Petrarch was an Italian poet, and the Petrarchan lover, as I've just mentioned, Romeo seems to be at the start of the play. Here is the definition. A Petrarchan lover is melodramatic, self-consciously suffering, and has given himself up to the power of his mistress. At the start of Romeo and Juliet, this is the character type that Shakespeare is making fun of when Romeo is drooping all over the stage for the great love of his life, Rosaline. Now, obviously, he switches his affections really quickly. So you could argue that Shakespeare is kind of poking fun at this stereotype. So Petrarch wrote a lot of sonnets to his love, but it was an unrequited love. So anybody who was suffering from unrequited love, any character in text at the time, they would be recognised as the Petrarchan lover because like Petrarch, they were brokenhearted. They were kind of chasing after someone who did not return those affections. And I think, why does Shakespeare do that? Why is he doing a little bit of mockery at the start? Because he thinks that it's not real love, it's not true love to mope after somebody who you kind of don't really know, and you're just usually obsessed with them based on their looks and their beauty, which is a little bit like Romeo at the start of this play. And obviously as the play develops, we see the true love beginning to develop between the characters. So we could argue that Shakespeare is just poking fun at that stereotype and saying that this is not true love, this Petrarchan love is not real, and it shows Romeo's immaturity. Romeo's exaggerated language in his early speeches allows the audience to see him as a young and inexperienced lover who is more in love with the concept of being in love than with the woman herself. In Act 1, oxymorons are employed heavily by Romeo to reflect his frustration and confusion at his love not being reciprocated. Now, oxymoron, you should all be familiar with this term, but it's two contradictory ideas put together, like bittersweet, love-hate, that type of phrase. So at the start, we see lots of oxymorons in Romeo's language. He talks about love, a loving hate, brawling love, loving hate, feather of lead. He talks about love being a smirk. He's basically showing that love has caused him suffering and pain, and he's very broken-hearted at the start of the play. Throughout the play, the imagery of eyes shines through, so there's lots of references to eyes. This is true of Romeo in Act 1. He's portrayed as a blind lover who doesn't believe that there could be another lady more beautiful than his Rosaline, and Benvolio obviously tells him to open his eyes and to examine other beauties. Romeo denies that he could be deluded by love, the religion of his eyes. So he's really obsessed in his views, and he's completely convinced that nobody could match up to the beauty of Rosaline. And obviously when he sees Juliet, he completely forgets Rosaline really quickly. And the friar points out to him, he says, how can this be real love? You've still got the tear stains on your cheeks from crying over Rosaline. So the friar recognises that Romeo is a little bit fickle at the start of the play, jumping from one love to another, which we could link to his immaturity. However, as the play progresses, Romeo's increasing maturity as a lover is clear through the change in his language. So he begins to speak in blank verse as well as rhyme, which means that his language sounds less artificial and more like everyday language, therefore more sincere and believable. The destiny of Romeo and Juliet are foreshadowed throughout the play. From even prior to meeting Juliet, Romeo has a sense of foreboding. He says, "My mind misgives, some consequence yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful date." So this adds to the tragedy of the play because it's as if Romeo envisages his own demise, but he can't escape it. This is his destiny. Upon meeting Juliet, the first speech in Act 1, Scene 5 is full of religious imagery. This implies that their love can only be seen alongside images of purity and devotion, a clear association with God. Romeo refers to Juliet as a saint, and this form of worship and putting his love above his religion would have been seen as quite blasphemous at the time. It would have been quite shocking because Romeo is worshipping Juliet like a god, and again, it shows his absolute devotion and his desire to be loved. Romeo belongs in a world defined by love rather than a world fractured by feud, as evident in the opening scenes. So obviously Romeo is not there at the start when they have the big street brawl. Tybalt's death in Act 3, Scene 1 brings about the clash between the private world of the lovers and the public world of the feud. And this is obviously when we see the demise of these characters. So Romeo gets drawn in to the violence when he has to, or when he feels compelled to get vengeance because Tybalt killed his best friend. Romeo is reluctant to fight Tybalt because they are now related through Romeo's marriage to Juliet. His maturity and loyalty are evident here. He is no longer this impulsive, impetuous character that we saw at the start, but a character that's more logical and committed. So he tries to convince Tybalt not to fight. He says, I love thy name as if it were my own." So he doesn't want to fight, but Tybalt refuses to back down. And again, we need to think about toxic masculinity here and the expectations on men in this patriarchal society. Tybalt doesn't know how to respond to Romeo other than to keep pushing for the fight. So when Tybalt kills Mercutio, Romeo, out of loyalty to his friend and anger at Tybalt's arrogance, kills Tybalt, thus avenging his friend's death. And you can see Romeo's pure rage here because he says it will be I or you, but one of us will fly with Mercutio tonight. So he doesn't want Mercutio's spirit to fly alone. But it's sad to see Romeo forced into this aggressive role because it's not really in his nature. At this point, he had placed his love of Juliet over his concern for Mercutio, and Mercutio was killed. So Romeo feels compelled to fight. He feels like his love has made him effeminate. He uses that word, effeminate, as if he's not a proper man because he's allowed his love to stop him from being aggressive. And again, if tragedy is a criticism of society, what could we say Shakespeare's criticising here? It's kind of a sad world if this, as a man, he feels compelled to fight out of misguided ideas about honour or duty or vengeance. It kind of portrays a sadness that people feel like because they're a man they should fight. So we can see that as a bit of a criticism. This reversion to immaturity is evident when Romeo is banished. So he literally lies on the floor of the friar's cell crying and wailing about his fate. When the nurse arrives, he clumsily attempts suicide. He's saying he would rather be dead than be banished. And he gets really told off by the friar. And again, he gets told pretty much to man up. The friar reminds him to consider Juliet and chides him for not thinking about the consequences of his actions for his wife. And then the friar offers him a course of action to follow and calms Romeo. And we can feel a little bit sorry for the friar here because he's getting drawn further into this. He thought the marriage would help heal the feud. So he was a little bit perhaps arrogant in his view that he could fix the feud. And now things are getting more and more out of control. He's got Romeo threatening suicide. So he has to keep pushing the plan further and further, and it becomes more outlandish. So we feel a little bit sorry for the friar here as well. However, we switch again later when Romeo receives the news of Juliet's death. He receives this news maturely and calmly, explains that he too must die. His only desire is to be with Juliet. So he says, "Well, Juliet, I will lie with thee tonight." And again, here we're seeing Romeo's hamartia because it's that impulsive nature that if he just waited, if he'd not been so rash, Juliet would have woken from the drug and they would have been reunited. But obviously Romeo is a tragic figure, so he has this fatal flaw, and his fatal flaw is his rash, impulsive nature that keeps reappearing throughout the play. His resolution is reflected in the violent image he uses to order Balthazar, his servant, to keep out of the tomb. So he says, "The time and my intents are savage, wild, more fierce and more inexorable far than empty tigers of the roaring sea." So he's full of rage at the world when he heads to Juliet's tomb. He kills Paris. He doesn't want to kill Paris, and this is again something that shows how he's matured as a character. Paris refuses to back down, and now Romeo says, run away, say that a madman spared your life, run away, but Paris won't back down. And they fight, and Romeo kills Paris. But Romeo takes pity on Paris and fulfills Paris's dying wish, which is to be laid next to Juliet. And the fact that Romeo has enough respect to lay Paris next to Juliet, who he's obviously married to, shows a maturity in his character. Romeo notes that both he and Paris are victims of fate and describes Paris as one writ with me in sour misfortune's book, since Paris experienced an unreciprocated love from Juliet, similar to Romeo's unrequited love for Rosaline. Romeo is also filled with compassion because he knows that Paris has died without understanding the true love that he and Juliet shared. So again, we see some emotional maturity from Romeo. In his final speech, it links back to the prologue, in which the star-crossed lovers, lives of the lovers are sacrificed to end the feud. So he says, "Oh, here will I set up my everlasting rest and shake the yoke of the inauspicious stars from this world-wearied flesh." So for someone so young, it's really tragic that he feels like the world has been nothing but a burden and suffering, and he seeks this freedom in death to be with Juliet. So what I've put together here are some key quotations from Romeo throughout the play, which you can explore, copy and make notes from independently. They're in chronological order, I think, and most of them have a little bit of a note afterwards, so just a few. He's a star-crossed lover, suggests that his demise is inevitable. His own father describes him as a heavy son, implying that he's lovesick. He says love is a smoke, and it's something that causes him pain, which is foreshadowing his eventual death. He says he has a heavy soul, a soul of lead, because he's so broken-hearted over Rosaline. Then when he sees Juliet, his language becomes really enriched and full of images of beauty, which show maturity. He says she's like a rich jewel. Did my heart love till now? So is this true love, or is he a little bit fickle, jumping from one girl to another? We have the religious imagery. He talks about his unworthy hand, and Juliet is this saint, this angel that he worships. We also have him calling her a bright angel and a pilgrim. So Shakespeare's presenting a real spiritual connection. He's prepared to give up everything for Juliet. Call me love and I'll be new baptized. So he's completely infatuated with her and prepared to give up his name if it means that he can be with her. When Tybalt kills Mercutio, he says that his love have softened Valor's steel and made him effeminate. So we see this really sad moment where he feels like his love has stopped him from being a real man, and therefore he gets vengeance on Tybalt. So we learn a little bit more about attitudes to men in society and what a man is expected to do. When he's banished, he says there is no world without Verona walls. So it shows that Juliet is his everything. Banishment, be merciful and say death. He would rather die than live without Juliet. At the end, we see him being completely ruined and destroyed, really, by the world. He goes to the apothecary, the guy, to get the drugs, and he says, I pay thy poverty, give me the drugs. He says, the world is not your friend. So we see a real sadness and an anger in Romeo. And then at the end, Paris, a madman's mercy bid thee run away. We see some maturity here. He tells Paris to run. Romeo doesn't want to be an aggressor. It's not in his nature, but still, he does kill Paris. And then we have this little bit of irony. He looks at Juliet and says, death's pale flag has not advanced there. She doesn't look dead, but we know that Romeo is impulsive and impatient, and before she has chance to wake, he kills himself. So death is amorous. Eyes look your last. He drinks the poison, seal with a righteous kiss. He kisses her and dies, and that is the tragic downfall of Romeo's character. So here is your task. Produce a character profile mapping out Romeo's actions, behaviour, character traits from Act 1 to 5 and include at least 8 quotations. Or you can design a Facebook page and a series of status updates exploring Romeo's character from Acts 1 to 5. You should try to use Romeo's voice, so embed his words and quotations into the statuses. And the turbo challenge is to do one of the other 2 tasks, the red or the amber. But then in addition, consider what Shakespeare teaches us through Romeo. What do we learn? Remember, tragedy is a criticism of society and a reflection of the events and actions that we undertake. So you might want to consider, his hamartia, his impulsive behaviour, expectations of men, his attitude to love, and think about what do we learn through Romeo, what lesson can we take away? Right, guys, thanks for listening, and that was your lesson on Romeo.